Hello everyone, it's Tejas here again with another electronics video, and today I have this, the new 11th gen Intel Core i9-11900 processor, and the new MSI B560M Pro VDH desktop motherboard. Whoa, stop. Guys, we did this last time. Okay, let's just rewind and I'll explain the definitions of each of these terms. First, the processor. So Intel is one of the two most popular brands that manufacture CPUs. They also manufacture SSDs, network cards, and much more. The other brand is AMD, which mainly manufactures CPUs and graphics cards. Core i9 is Intel's flagship performance processor made for heavy working and multitasking. 11900 is the model number. 11 means 11th gen, and 900 just means, well, 900. And to be honest, there's not much else to it. Next, the motherboard. MSI is the manufacturer of the board. B560 is the chipset of the board, which tells us what processors we can use. This one supports 10th gen and 11th gen Intel Core processors. This motherboard is a Pro variant, meaning it has a few more features than normal. VDH describes the video outputs of the onboard graphics controller. In this case, we have HDMI, DisplayPort, and VGA video outputs. For reference, most monitors today use HDMI. Right. All that is cool, but what's a processor and what's a motherboard? Okay, here we go. The processor is the brains of the computer. It literally does everything that you can think of. Playing music, writing documents, playing games, everything really. Now, just like a drive, which you can learn about in the video linked above, it is one of the core components of the computer. Some people call it a CPU, or Central Processing Unit, which is a more accurate term. Inside the processor, there are millions of tiny switches called transistors. These switches are either on or off, and store ones and zeros respectively. These switches can direct electricity throughout the chip, carrying out instructions given to the CPU. So you can see how a computer cannot operate without this piece. Now that we know what happens inside, how can we judge a processor if we can't see those transistors? Now, each CPU has many key statistics: core count, thread count, clock speed, memory types, memory speed, cache, integrated graphics, TDP, and price. But that's too much, so we'll narrow it down to just three: core count, thread count, and clock speed. Now, CPUs actually have multiple processors inside, and these are called cores. This is why I said earlier that a CPU is a more accurate term. These cores play a huge part in the performance of the CPU, but can also add weight, and most importantly, price. A good CPU today should have around 6 cores or more. Mine has 8 for reference. In software, the physical cores of a CPU are usually divided into virtual cores, which are called threads. Each thread can run a single process, and all CPUs can have a maximum of 2 threads per actual core. Since this is correlated with cores, the weight and price go up for more threads as well. For mine, I have 8 cores and 16 threads. The clock speed measures how fast the CPU can complete each process, in gigahertz or billions of processes per second. For any CPU, there are always 2 speeds: base and boost, which are ranges of the clock speed. For mine, the base is 2.5 GHz and the boost is 5.2 GHz, meaning that the clock speed will not go below 2.5 or above 5.2. It's good to know about both, but the maximum is obviously more important than the minimum. Now, the motherboard is, well, the motherboard. It is essentially the skeletal, nervous, and circulatory systems all in one. It is the main structure of all the parts. It connects everything in the entire PC electronically and provides power to all those components. It really is one of the most essential parts of the computer. Unlike a CPU, for a motherboard, there's a lot more that we can see with our eyes. Key features on a motherboard include the CPU socket, chipset, memory slots, PCIe expansion slot, SATA ports, M.2 slot, audio and LAN chipsets, various system connectors, and size. Various combinations of these features exist, with different price points, so price is more up to you. Now, when buying a motherboard, first look at the necessities: the CPU socket, memory type, chipset, and the PCIe slot. Many CPU sockets exist, but all desktops are either LGA or PGA. LGA, or land grid array, contains a surface of hundreds of pins that touch contact points on the CPU. PGA, or pin grid array, is the complete opposite. The socket now has hundreds of holes, and the CPU has all the pins. My Intel processor uses LGA 1200, which means it has 1200 of those tiny pads that touch the socket. The chipset tells us more compatibility info, such as what CPUs can be installed, the number of memory slots, and Optane support. For memory, right now there are 5 types: DDR, DDR2, DDR3, DDR4, and you guessed it, DDR5. But this is a subject for another video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Each type has a different connector and faster transfer speeds than their predecessors. PCIe is a standard for graphics card slot that has 5 versions and 4 types. X16s are the longest ones and are used for graphics cards. After these necessities are met, look at the price. Price is a huge contributor to what your motherboard can do. For example, a higher price could gift you a more powerful chipset, onboard Wi-Fi, and maybe more USB ports, while a lower price could get you a more value-based motherboard. Motherboards can have you pick and choose what options you want and how much you are willing to pay for it, making it one of the more customizable parts of your computer. Want to know what CPU or motherboard you have? On Windows, open the Start menu and type System Information. Hit Enter and you can see a bunch of useful information about your hardware. Here you can find your motherboard and CPU model. On macOS, usually you can't find out your motherboard, but your CPU can be found by clicking the Apple icon, then About this Mac. It will be listed as the processor. On Linux, it's also simple. Open Terminal and type INXI-FXZ. This will show you pretty much all of your hardware details pertaining to your computer. You can find your motherboard under the Machine section and the CPU under the CPU section. They should be listed as Model. Now, a situation that you may find yourself in is when your CPU breaks down or you want to upgrade it. If you're using a laptop, sadly, you're out of luck. Rising demand for light form factors have removed full-size CPU sockets, so you'll have to just look for a new laptop. You can skip to this timecode. However, if you use a desktop like me, well then, let's do it. When looking to upgrade, first look at the socket. This is the physical compatibility of the CPU and both must match. For example, an LGA 1200 CPU will not match an LGA 1151 motherboard. After confirming that the socket matches, we can look at some electronic compatibility. We already went over what a chipset is and how to find yours, so research yours and make sure it's compatible with your generation of CPU. The chipset info can be found on Wikipedia if you search for the socket, and the generation can be found on the manufacturer's website. TDP, or thermal design power, is how much heat the CPU can create. It's also something worth taking a quick look at and can also be found on the manufacturer's website. The TDP of the new CPU should be close to that of the old one, otherwise heating issues may arise. Well, that's it. There's all you need to know about motherboards and CPUs and how to buy one. Now I'm going to install my new stuff. Okay, here we go with the installation. First, we have to unscrew the thumb screws and then remove the side panels. Stow these all in a safe place so that they don't get damaged. Now we need to remove the old parts. What I did was disconnect everything attached to the case, like the graphics card, SATA cables, front panel connectors, power cables, and the 8 screws holding the motherboard in place. Then we remove the motherboard and its old I/O shield. If anything is blocking it from coming out, you will have to move it. For me, this was the hard drive at the bottom. It's much easier to remove the CPU, memory, and any M.2 drives while the motherboard is outside. If you want to learn more about M.2 drives, click the link in the top right corner. Now since these parts aren't the focus of the video, I'll just show these clips all together at once. Remove the M.2 drive, memory, and old CPU. Be very careful when exposing the socket here and put the protective cap on immediately to avoid any damage. Alright, now it's time to install the new parts. First, the motherboard. Remove it from its box, and place it on that box to avoid any electrostatic shocks. Now get ready to install the new CPU. Locate the socket. It should be pretty big, and should have that protective cap on it. Next, unlock the retention arm and open the socket. Place the CPU very slowly into the socket, matching the golden triangles, and then give it a wiggle to ensure it is fully seated. Then close the door and lock the retention arm. The protective cap should pop out on its own. Now place the cooler on top of the CPU, putting the wire facing the fan header on the motherboard. Then push the cooler into place. The plastic pegs should fixate themselves on the other side of the motherboard. Then just follow everything else backwards. Install the M.2 drive and memory. Then one would think you just place the motherboard inside the case, right? Wrong! You must never forget the I/O shield when installing a motherboard. It can be your worst nightmare when you realize there's no covering on the back of that case. Yeah, there we go. Now we can place the motherboard into the case and screw it in. Then we connect everything else. You have the graphics card's power, front panel connectors, SATA cables, and power for everything. Then comes cable management. I like to use a bunch of cable ties to tidy everything up on both sides. And yes, I cable manage even though I don't have tempered glass side panels. Attach the 2 side panels that you stowed earlier, screw in the thumb screws, and bam! There you go, a whole new PC. So, what more? What changed in the computer and how can you or I tell? Well, if it was an upgrade, you'll probably notice it immediately. Apps will open faster, they'll hang for less time, and it's just overall a better experience. In my situation, I doubled my cores, quadrupled my threads, and can process 1.4 billion more processes per second. As such, I experienced a huge performance increase. And if you simply replaced a broken CPU and didn't upgrade it, you'll likely see a small performance increase as well, since it's, well, new. I hope this video was informative for you. It certainly was a blast for me to make and put together. If you want to know more, I'll have some links in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe and have fun. I completely forgot how to open this, and I need scissors to do that too.
Nah, I can't see